Hey everybody, Tag Life Done Free. Hey, today I have a very special video for you. I brought four of the most knowledgeable people that I know in reference to groups and communities together, and we're going to do a four-part series on building a community. And this is just part one. It's going to be kind of an overview. The next three will be on the different layers of that community, and we'll explain that kind of in the video. But if you want to see the other three and you want to be notified, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification button. So without further ado, come on. All right, hey everybody. Hey, this is a video that I've been looking forward to doing very long time. We're going to do a four-part series based on how to build a community. And we've assembled a group of preppers and homesteaders who have been living this lifestyle for more than a decade. Each one of these men have a lot to contribute, and no matter where you are in your journey, they can help. So I guess let me just do some introductions real quick. So the first guy I want to introduce is Spags. Say hi, Spags.
Hey, hi, Spags.
Hi, Spags. Hey, Spags been living the prepper survivalist life for many years. Here in the Midwest, Spags is kind of known as an elder. He's been part of many different groups and also has been a promoter of many of the prepper type expos. Next is Data. Say hey, Data.
Hey, Data.
Hey, Data. You guys. Data's been living this life again for over a decade. I have personally attended many events and adventures with Data. He offers years of practical prepper experience. Last but not least is Hitch. Say hi, Hitch.
Hey there. This thing on?
Yeah. Hitch is kind of the OG homesteader. He left the entertainment world for the homesteading world back during the 2008 housing crash. One of the most knowledgeable people I know when it comes to animals, plants, those kind of things. So everyone on this call has experience in multiple community settings, whether it's from the prepper or the homesteading community. So let's get started. I guess I'll just start with Spags. So Spags, tell us why community matters.
Because you have to sleep at some point. You have to have a community. The lone wolf mentality is dangerous and will get you killed. And quite frankly, we are a communal animal, and communal people need to have fellowship, and fellowship brings with it an air of safety, and it brings with it an air of, well, community. And without the community, what's the point?
Yeah, Data, you want to add to that?
Oh, yeah. He hit the nail on the head. By nature, we're social creatures by design. One of the things that COVID-19, or excuse me, the great CV19 reset taught us was that isolation leads to depression, and people seeking each other out. It's just a natural instinct. So going back to the concept of I guess, like Bobby had mentioned, tribalism and socialized hierarchies and structures, I think that's the most obvious, self-evident reason for community.
Yeah. Hitch, you got anything to add?
I'd agree with Spags, what he originally said. An old Marine told me one time that you can't stay awake forever. And, when you're doing something else, someone's got to be watching your back. And I put a lot of faith in that. I believe that's very true.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of other side effects that come from it, from my world. We talk about how we spread resources, and, we're going to get into a lot of these things as these, videos progress. But the mental side is certainly an interesting part. I've gotten calls from guys like Mo, who I've interviewed before, who said, thanks for just listening. So I think there's a lot of parts of that. So Bobby, let's talk a little bit about you first. So talk a little bit about your background, talk about, where you come from as far as the community perspective, kind of what your experiences are there.
Sure. I have been in the world of prepping as a general term since probably 1997. Since then, the terms have changed. The ideology has changed. The reasons for doing things, at least on the surface, have changed. But from then until now, I was the vice president of Kansas Prepper Expo. And then from there, we transitioned into full spectrum preparedness. I've been a guest on various podcasts and YouTube channels like yours. I've traveled around Northeast Kansas and even into Missouri to give talks at different prepping groups, at different homestead groups, all on a variety of topics. And now I pretty much preside here in where I live, and things are starting to blossom again. And so the invitations are starting to come back in again. The requests are coming back in, the camp outs, maybe some other events are going to start happening again. And so I hope to be a part of it.
Yeah. Data, you want to kind of go through the same thing, a little bit about your background and,
Sure.
in reference to community?
Like you mentioned, you and I, we've ran on a handful of adventures together over the last couple of few years, and we've met our share of um, dungeon masters to, guys with Guinness World Record of ancient cats.
Or white hats with yellow glasses?
Yes, yes, yes. In tropical environments
Tropical environments, yeah.
and so this kind of started for me when my wife and I, we were young. We were a pretty young couple. We moved to Denver, Colorado. I took an engineering job. Had no idea what I was getting myself into. We went there with a 1978 Trans Am, Formula 400 Trans Am that me and my father-in-law rebuilt. Posi, man, that car was beautiful. It's like a kind of a ugly baby shit green, but it was a badass car. And a Dodge Neon. And that year we moved there, we had 3 back-to-back blizzards. And we were just we were overwhelmed, man. I'll never forget I don't even know how to describe it, the feeling of helplessness. We were running out of milk at the time. My wife and I both smoked cigarettes. The baby's out of formula. We're out of food in the house. And the snow at the time, this is 2 weeks into this blizzard, it was still 3 feet deep. And so I had to try to venture out. I had to walk, it was about a mile and a half to the nearest grocery store. And when I got there, the only thing left was like the menthol, Virginia Slims, the weird Turkish cigarettes. And there was absolutely no milk, no bread, no cheese, no baby formula. It was a very eye-opening experience for us. So that kind of catapulted our journey into where, in around, I guess, 2010, 2011, we moved to the KC area. And that's where I met a bunch of good folks like yourself. And eventually, Brother Hitch and Brother Spags. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, cool. Hitch, you want to just talk real quick about where you come from?
Sure. With regards to, I guess we call it prepping today. I've always grown up doing that. We didn't call it prepping, it's just how we lived. I grew up fairly modest. My grandparents were around to see the Depression. And so again, it's just always, you always put away more food. If you have an ample harvest, you process it all, can it, dry it, put it away, because next year might not be so great. Those folks lived through that stuff and they just passed it on. And I just continued doing it. At one point I, lived out in California and was in the, as Tag had said, I was in the entertainment business. And even then, living in the city, I kept chickens in the backyard, grew a garden, and went and did nightclub events in Las Vegas and San Francisco through my company. But eventually I moved away from that and secured another location, and been full bore ever since. So yeah, I've just always done it.
Yeah. So I guess just to kind of start this thing off, all of us, it's funny, we use kind of different terms for it, but all of us kind of agree that there's a series of circles or a process or whatever it is you want to call it into building a community. And that's why we're going to do several videos, is because we'll cover each one of those kind of in depth. But Spags, you want to give us just kind of an outline of those 3 circles or that process?
Sure. You and I have had this conversation a couple of times, but there's basically 3 concentric circles of influence. And you have the largest one, which is you go out, you meet people casually. They're all around you. Over time, the people you tend to associate with hold similar values. So even the people you would call acquaintances, even the people you only know partially, are going to sort of kind of be like you and have a mentality like you. But these aren't the people you're telling your deepest secrets to. These aren't the people that you are having in-depth conversations with about how to utilize the square footage of your basement. They might not even know you have a basement. Then you have the group in the middle, which I like to refer to as the MAG, or the Mutual Assistance Group. And this is where the circle starts to tighten. It's where you have a little more familiarity, a little less secrecy. You talk a little more openly about some of the things you do, and you have conversations that might, let's say, revolve around, well, what are you going to do if such and such happens, or where do you and your family plan to go? And you might start breaching those more intimate conversation levels. And then you have what I call the group. That's your group. That's your people. Those are the folks that you have sworn before God and country, whoever, that you are going to ride out the storm with. And those are the people that you meet with regularly, the people you prep with regularly, the people that operate on your homestead regularly, whatever terminology you want to use. And to me, those are the three concentric circles, and they just kind of get tighter and tighter, just like a target would, until you're honing in on that very center portion to decide how you're going to mediate potential crises in the future.
Hitch, you got anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Aside from setting up locations and knowing where people are and having meetings and discussions with the other people, that's all pretty firm.
Yeah, Data, and I know you got a lot of experiences. I know the terminology is different, but you got anything you want to add?
It's a pretty easy concept, again, Spags hit the nail on the head with that one too. The references that it's been called over the years, in like concentric rings, or your outer and inner circles, or outer and inner rings. I know it's been called the crew, the mag, the mind over time. Just different perceptions of where people in particular benefit, I guess, friends with benefit levels reside, for lack of a better term, in the world of, I guess, Wild West community. You needed a blacksmith, you needed a shopkeep, you needed a barkeep, so that kind of crew mag mind necessity, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think, in my opinion, you can't really get to the end one, which is obviously everybody's goal, without the first two. They're kind of dependent on each other. So Data, why are they dependent on each other? Or first, I guess, first of all, do you even agree with that statement that you can't have one without the other two?
I think it's very difficult to have one without the other two. Like you said, having the end game or the end goal of the crew, I suppose, or the inner circle, whatever you want to refer to it as, the family, as Bobby said, the people that you prep and you fight and you train with. In order to get there, it takes a lot of time, a lot of trust, a lot of patience, a lot of empathy, compassion, a lot of golf clubs and clues, and maybe a couple of conclusions along the way.
Yeah. Hitch, you have any comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to go through that, those stages with the people you meet. The people have a like mindset to what you believe and what you're doing. You kind of interview them to be friends, and interview them to be people you might hang around with, and then you make decisions based on, as Data said, clues. You get clues about them, because if they're someone like one of us, we don't reveal a whole lot of information. We might even misdirect a little bit when we first meet people, and so there's this dance that you do, and then as you get to know somebody, maybe you move them to the next level, where they're perhaps a mutual assistance group or whatever, and you find out about them and maybe who their group is, or maybe they don't have a group. But really, there's one of the things that a smart guy told me one time. Someone's part of your inner circle, your tribe, or your core group, if you're in your mind, that if something happened to you in your stead, they would take over caring for your children as if they were your own. And in turn, you have no doubt in your mind you'd do the same for them. I think that's, for me, one of the biggest tests. In my mind, if I have that feeling, then that's personally, these people are going to be part of my inner crew. Because everyone else is, you just don't know. And over time, you may not know what you don't know, but you're always searching.
Yeah, I've always thought of those circles as just the kind of an interview process. Can I deal with someone's almost BS? Yeah, right. Anyway, I kind of always thought of it as an interview process, and how do you get through those cycles, and how do you learn to trust? And people who live this lifestyle are kind of recluse anyway. How you kind of get through all of that. But Bobby, do you think you can have one without the other?
Absolutely not. It's like dating.
Mhm.
When you're 15, 16, and you're finally getting out into the world of meeting somebody, of the other gender, which I can't speak to. I'm not a biologist, but you have the whole world out there full of all these girls, right? Or all these guys. You go to high school, that circle narrows down, right? To your school or to your class or to maybe the town you grew up in. And that circle continuously gets smaller until you finally find the one. Well, you never could have found the one if you didn't have the 10,000 to begin with. You can't catch the fish unless you go to the ocean where there's a million fish. And it's the same when it comes to having this kind of lifestyle. You can't have the final result unless you've had years of mulling through the options.
Yeah. So how do you stay motivated? Because it can be a very long, kind of stressful process, right?
Yeah. For me, the motivation comes when you divorce the novelty away from things, when you stop thinking about it in terms of, oh, this person's now the president, I should be concerned, or this is happening over there, so I should be concerned, or over here, the price of this has gone up, so I should be concerned. You have to divorce yourself from the constant cycle of what's going wrong. Because if you attach yourself to the cycle of what's going wrong, there will never be anything that goes right, and you will get fatigued very quickly and you will give up.
Yeah, it's through my experience, it's been interesting to see how groups of people come together and how groups of people fall apart, for some, fairly, silly things. And, Data, you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I know you know this well. You want to talk about, just being patient with other people and, tolerant of other people and, those kind of things.
Oh God, yeah. So the community dynamics are absolute ebbs and flows of personalities and, I guess for lack of a better term, periods. It's just like you kind of brushed on earlier, being able to tolerate another person's BS, and to what level or what extent, and vice versa, and then being able to do that with some compassion, a little genuine. You use the word tolerance, and although I think it's a fitting word, I think having some compassion mixed in with that tolerance kind of goes a long way, because it's easy to be tolerant of something, but to do it where you still give a shit or you still care, where at the end of the day, you're like, well, I understand what they're going through. You know what I mean? Yeah, kind of an ebbs and flow process.
Yeah, I've always said, and I know every one of you have heard me say these words, but the hardest lesson in life's not everybody's you. And as long as you are setting your standards based upon, your own set or your own self-belief, you're going to be constantly disappointed, throughout the process. A lot of it too is making good decisions and, along the way, and not necessarily making quick decisions. But so how does decisions play? How does making a good decision play into all this?
You got to do a lot of thinking. One of the things that I learned a long time ago from a therapist that I saw after my first divorce, he said to me, not every question requires an immediate answer. And he also said, not every question even requires an answer. And, what I took away from that is, look before you leap, think before you speak, and apply this into your decision making, when interacting with others. And like you said, not everyone's you, there's just so much to consider. Really, at the end of the day, there's so much psychology goes into what the lifestyles that we lead. I'll say, because Edmund said, yeah, everything's sales and math. And again, it boils down to that. And so, if you're a good salesman, you're good at knowing people and listening to people and applying, all these principles all together. Well, you can apply the same principles to the people that you're considering, forming a group with, or, being in your mag and so forth. Because again, like Data said, there's going to be some people that there's going to be things you don't like about them. There might be things, I know another meeting once it was discussed that you might have someone in your group that has a very polar opposite religious view of yours. They might be an atheist, or they might be, if you're a Christian, they might be a Muslim. But putting those things aside and, recognizing that there's a grander scheme, a grander scale that you're, trying to attempt to achieve, these goals, that's important. So there's a lot of thought has to go in this decision-making process.
Yeah, I think tolerance matters. Bobby, you want to comment on all that?
Yeah, there was a song that came out back in the late 90s called Everyone's Free to Wear Sunscreen. And one of my favorite lines in that song is work hard to bridge the gaps in geography and lifestyles of your friends. And I don't think that it could be said any better than that. There can be very large voids, very big gaps in geography, you know, in the lifestyle between you and someone that you will eventually find yourself paired up with. If you can't navigate that, how are you going to kill 100 zombies in an hour together? You know, I mean, and I'm using that term very flippantly, obviously, it's kind of become the catchphrase, but if you can't deal with people's idiosyncrasies right now, when you have running water, electricity, and Walmart right down the road, how in the bloody hell are you going to do it when you're 3 weeks in with no toilet and where somebody else's kid has been screaming nonstop because you can't warm a bottle up? You know, I mean, prepping is a dirty business. And if you're not prepared to get down and dirty with people because you couldn't look past the fact that they didn't vote for who you voted for, or because they don't watch the same TV shows you watch, or because they don't go to the same church as you, then you're probably not in a very good place.
Yeah, you know, I want to get into at some point here today. I'd like to talk a little bit about what to look for. But before we get there, I think it's more important. You know, I get a lot of messages about how do you find your tribe? How do you go about doing it? Where do you go? And so if each one of you will, talk a little bit about, different ways that you've done it. I'll kind of start just kind of going around a little bit. I've met each one of these people very differently. One answered an email to that was just looking for a community. And the relationship started out slow, ended up being great friends. I went to a gathering in a bigger city, not too far from me. There was a meeting there where I met another one of you. Now here we are, 7 years later or whatever it is. And then, the third, just working in those circles that you talk about, working in that outer circle, that inner circle, you kind of grow to be friends in that. But so Data, let's start with you. So if you brand new person, just trying to find a tribe, whether, that's other homesteads or whatever it is, preppers, how do you go about finding them? What would you do?
Oh gosh, that's a strange question to be asked at this point in my life. Looking back, thinking back to when I was in high school and trying to learn how to date and all the nuances and subtleties of courtship. It's all applicable today in this kind of realm that we operate in. Yeah, you've been there. All of you guys have been with me at some point where we've ran into people that were courting to be a part of a tribe, or they're courting you to be a part of a tribe. And it's just, it's interesting that you kind of look in areas that are familiar to you. Like you'd mentioned, you'd ran into somebody at a larger gathering in a city near you. You went there because it was familiar to you. You went there because you were comfortable going there, or you met somebody at another event. You find these people in the places that you frequent. Like Hitch had kind of talked about earlier, you're not going to find a good, strong Christian relationship at a mosque, or maybe you will, maybe you won't, but I don't think you will. Maybe you will, but yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that, that meeting that I was just mentioning. Had I not attended that meeting that one day, I wouldn't be living on the piece of land I live on today.
Yeah,
because that relationship grew slowly over time. I got a phone call that said, hey, this lady might sell. I called the lady, negotiations, blah, 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 blah. But I would not be on the piece of land that I'm on today. I wouldn't be sitting right here talking to you guys today had it not been, for that 45-minute window, that one day that I decided, I'll go.
You find them in your community, but it takes more than being a keyboard ninja. It takes more than sending an email or responding to an email. It takes physically getting out and shaking hands, and then taking the time to get to know them. Like I think Hitch hinted on it earlier. The dating feels like dating. You date this person or court this person for a while, and you'll find them at different levels of where either your interest fades and it was just a fad, a fling, if you will, or it blossoms into something else, like a great friendship.
Yeah. Bobby, you were nodding your head a bunch there.
Yeah, it was good. It's all true. I can't count the number of people that over the last 20 some years of doing this that I've met who have fallen away. But I also can't count the number of people that I've met over the last 20 years that in some facet are still here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hitch, what do you think about all that?
I think a lot about that. So I'd say first and foremost, the original question was if you're a new person into this and you want to try to find a group, right?
Yep. Or build one.
Or build one.
How do you meet people?
Sure. What sort of are your core areas of preparation, for you personally, and define, thyself, right? What are your skills? What do you bring to the table? Okay, then go and take a look at clubs, events that you can go to where you would meet people that are of like mindset. And then as you meet those people, you can let on that, oh, hey, I'm a gardener and I save seeds and I have, I've kind of done heirloom seeds, and you're showing your value to them. Because in what Spags and Data both said about dating, we'll go back to the nightclub era for me, and successful guys, meet girls because they had value, right? They're the guy that's the DJ, or they're the singer for the band, or they're the drummer, or they're the good looking bartender, or they're the bartender who can do tricks. Okay, you have some value to the people that are meeting you, right? Everyone wants to get to know that guy. So if let's say, for example, you go to a prepper type event meeting, which is where I've met some great people. There'll be people there you don't want anything to do with, and you'll identify that. There'll be people there that are freppers or mall ninjas, that again, you're sitting there thinking to yourself, ooh, that person's not going to make it when things go south. But just keep your eyes and ears open. Don't make any quick judgments. Just everything's a clue, not a conclusion. Because there could be some misdirection there. Someone might be kind of playing a little bit just to, because they want to listen and see what people do and how they react. But definitely, going to these type of events where you're going to find a target-rich environment of individuals that at least have a similar mindset, right? So, if I was going to go through a list, Mother Earth News Fair, they have those across the country. That's a great place to, meet a whole bunch of like-minded people. Gun shows, of course, are always really, really popular with, with people in the crowd. Home and garden shows, it may not be as rich with the preppers, but might be homesteaders there. Fairs, like state and county fairs, there's going to be livestock and gardening events and stuff like that. But then again, going back to sales, you can't be shy. So a really a great thing that me and my inner circle that are in sales always talk about is just ask. Well, I would take that to just open your mouth. So if I met Spags at an event and I see him and his family, and I'm there with my family, it's like, okay, well, they've got kids similar age to mine, they're similar to my age, and we happen to be standing there watching a demonstration of a Timber King sawmill. Mm-hmm. I'll strike up a conversation. I'll say, hey, have you got one of these? And, potentially he'll talk back and forth and we'll get to know each other, and you got to just spur on conversation. And I realize that some people are introverts and it might be difficult for them to do that, but you're going to have to step out of your comfort zone a little bit, because if you don't, the greatest guy that you could have ever met might be sitting across the table from you at a Subway, restaurant in a meeting, and because you didn't open your mouth, you never met him. Mm-hmm. And just garden clubs. There's people, we want to talk about Facebook, Meta, there's countless groups in there that are not prepper groups where you can meet some really great, solid people. And you might even find that they're in some of the same groups you are in your region, homesteading groups, animal trade groups. Mm-hmm. I recently met a really, really stellar person in a dog group that I belong to, and it's a nationwide group. And, realistically, I meet a lot of people through some of these bigger groups on Facebook, and they may not be people that I'm going to huddle down with, mm-hmm. but I guess we talked about the layers earlier. there's this other layer that I have that's like my national and international group of people that some of them I've never ever met in person. I may not ever get to meet in person because of geography and, costs and so on. But the ability to have all these people that I know around the world and around the country to get direct news from them as opposed to the mass media, man, that's been big. But then in some cases you meet people that, oh, well, their Facebook page says they live in, Oregon, but they're like, well, I don't live in Oregon anymore. I actually live in, Oklahoma. And then it's like, well, I live in Oklahoma, and the next thing you know, you're meeting more people, or they've got a cousin that lives nearby you or whatever. But just always have the nose sniffing for those details, make notes, have a notebook, carry a notebook with you when you go places, or put it in your phone or whatever, because you just never know. And it is just like dating. And so how are you going to get a call back? You got to exchange phone numbers. You got to exchange emails. You want to take another level deeper there, folks, you can have more than one email. Really, you can have like a spare email that's like your extra email that you give out to new people. So like if they turn out to be, a stalker and a weirdo, you can go, bye-bye, I'm not bringing you into the inner circle, there is so much there to this specific subject. And even when you think you've got a great group and you feel like, oh, your spaces are full, keep doing this.
Mm-hmm.
People age out, people die off, people fade out of the scene, like Spags mentioned earlier. They reach a point of what is commonly referred to as prepper fatigue, and or they get divorced and their life dramatically changes. And so you need to have extra people coming into your group, because the other thing is, if you're looking at this as a BOL type of, can we say that here? Is that,
I think so, everyone say.
Okay, you got bug out location.
Mm-hmm.
Then not everybody's going to make it to your bug out location, guys. And as I remind people all the time, constantly reminding people this, oh, I've got this, and I've got a truck, and I've got a trailer, and I've got all these other thunder sticks and stuff I'm going to bring along. And I'm like, yeah, and you might not make it past the picket line with more than the clothes on your back. Okay, well, that in turn, there might be a lot of people that are planning on going to your BOL that just don't make it. So maybe plan for extras and hope for the best.
Yeah, I've found some interesting avenues at places like local auctions, and you go stand in a line, and there's a wind turbine for sale, or there's chicken this or that, or there's there's some like-minded opportunities from that. Online boards, you talked a little bit about Facebook, but there's a lot of just blogs and boards and stuff that are out there. Bobby, do you have any other ideas of where people can go look?
Exposing
As much as I hate to say it, social media can be your friend as much as we know it to be the enemy.
Yeah.
What's that really weird one you use?
I use MeWe. I don't use Bookface. I don't use Twitter Pated or TikTok or Instaban or any of that bullshit. I use only free speech friendly platforms, which limits me completely, to be completely honest, because everybody's so addicted to the dopamine in their life they can't get rid of the mainstream stuff. But there's a handful of us who have, and there's other people that are already on those types of alternative social media networks who never were on the big ones to begin with. So you're going to find people you didn't know existed in your own sphere of influence. Having been the guy that put on the expos with a core group of my friends there for a while, shows and trade shows and expos that are specifically geared towards the lifestyle choices we make. Even boat shows can be a good place to find people. Outdoor shows, going to Cabela's, going to just hanging around the gun counter at a Walmart during an ammo shortage and listening to conversations can be very, very beneficial. I've met some folks in all of those venues that I still talk to today.
Yeah. Data, you were going to say something? Go ahead.
It's kind of funny. The one thing I think we all kind of glazed over is like this month, the end of this month, there's a handful of us getting together. We're hosting a local prepping camp out. Kind of a meet and greet, handshake, come one, come all. Don't matter what your race, creed, color, religion is. It's pretty equal and even across the board. And we've been doing it for a better part of 10 years now or so.
Yeah, I think this is the 18th one, right?
Yeah. This is the 18th one we've done.
Now go ahead and give it a plug. Where do
people
find information about that?
the Midwest Preparedness Project, and it's on the weird thing that that Spags mentioned earlier on MeWe. So it's on the book face.
And it's also on Facebook, correct?
It's on the book face. It's on the MeWe. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if anybody's interested in it, feel free to go check it out, and you'll find a lot of these weird characters on there. But just to kind of summarize, it sounds like to me the consensus here is you just got to go get involved.
Yes, complacency is your number one enemy, and being comfortable is your number one enemy. If you think you've got it, like Hitch said, if you think you got it figured out, and you've got 10 guys, they're all kitted up. One's a dentist, one's a veterinarian, and one's a doctor, and 3 of them are former Marines or whatever. And you're like, man, my group is solid. He's absolutely right. How do you know they're all going to get to where they're going? So concentric circles, man, layers.
Yeah, I've always
said is like an onion, and onions have layers.
Parfaits. Everybody likes parfaits.
Yeah. I've always said that out of our comfort zone is the only place we grow. And if you're unwilling to get uncomfortable, you're always going to be where you are.
Amen. Hoorah.
100%.
Yep. So now that we've talked about where to find people, let's talk a little bit about how to identify whether that's the right kind of person, because it's a long process, right? But there are some things that you can do to shorten that process. And real quick, you guys heard Data talk earlier about the golf club. And I'll tell this a real quick story. So I kind of put it into reference. Early in my career, we went to Ireland to play some golf, and we were going to promote a sales guy to the top sales guy position. And, it's a $250,000 a year job, and went there. Everything was fine. Come back home, come to find out a month later that the guy had stolen a golf club, $325 golf club. So we got a bill for this golf club, and I went to the CEO and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. It's on me, my responsibility, my fault." And when you think somebody would be mad, what he said, I'll never forget. He said, "No, what a blessing that we didn't make a $250,000 mistake." I'll never forget that. That was just such a big moment in my life. And so when you heard Data refer to the golf club, that's what he was referring to. But anyway, Bobby, what I was going to ask you is, there are things that how do you speed up the process? Because it is a long process. How do you know they're decent people? What can you do?
If you're a strategist, and I know everybody on this particular call is, you will force situations of honesty. You're going to, and some people will call this manipulation. And you know what? It most certainly is. There's nothing wrong with that word. Data will tell you that all day, and he's absolutely right. There's nothing wrong with manipulating some very benign, very danger-free scenarios in which you can tell whether somebody is or isn't something you want to be with. And the number one, in my book, the number one character trait that matters is honesty. And I've always said it like this: there's a 3-tier phased honesty, and I call it the life, wife, wallet. If I can trust you with my life, I was in the Army for a long time. There was a lot of people I could trust with my life, but there was no way in hell I'd trust them around my wife. Right? And then there was plenty of people I could trust with my life, and I could trust them around my wife, but I certainly couldn't trust them around my wallet. And that has been true outside of the Army as well. If I can't trust you in all 3, you're not going to be in that inner circle. And so there may be times where I force a scenario unbeknownst to you that I'm going to see whether or not I can do something. I might coordinate with somebody else to do that. Look, businesses and governments do this all the time, and no one blinks an eye. Why the hell should I be any different? Why should I trust the safety of my family and the group I'm trying to build to the fates? I'm going to find out one way or the other, and I'm going to force some situations in which I'm going to find out whether I can believe you or not. And from there, we'll progress.
Well, the truth is, I just manipulated my hand to touch my hat, right? So manipulation with a good purpose and with honor, right? I don't find anything wrong with it. And, you mentioned Data, and this kind of comes from Data a little bit, but, you got any pointers there, Data, as far as how to speed the process up, how to make good decisions?
Oh yeah, to caveat what you guys said, basically manipulate, it's not a bad word. It's the context in which it's applied. Like you'd hinted at, it's the use of the word. You manipulate things all day. You manipulate your cell phone, toilet paper, the handle, on your car, whatever, your coffee maker. You manipulate those things all day long. But your intent, I think, is what kind of dictates, um, I guess, the use of the word. So in speeding, trying to speed these things up, sometimes I think you can, sometimes I think you can't, because some people are better at OPSEC and some people are better at just, putting up a front or putting on a mask, or pretending at who they are or who they aren't. I mean, it's there. We've tried. I know me and the group that I run with. We've tried for the better part of a decade to force those situations like Spags had mentioned, and it's sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. It's just kind of hit or miss. Like Spag said, I think one of the best ways is, again, putting people in those morally or socially obligated scenarios where they're forced to make a decision in which you then could ascertain whether or not that was a golf club or whether or not that was an attaboy, and you kind of make a mental note of either that was a red flag or, what, he's a stand-up SOB.
Yeah. Hitch, comment?
When I was a young man, I worked at a restaurant and I was just a dishwasher and, floor sweeper guy. And I hadn't worked there for more than maybe a week. And it's closing time. The owner's there with me, and there's maybe a couple other people in the building, finishing up out front, and I'm back in the kitchen sweeping and mopping. And as I sweep underneath the cook line, I pull a $20 bill out with the broom. Well, I pick that up and I walk down to the office and I go up to the owner and I say, "Hey, I found this $20 bill underneath the cook line back here." And he says, "Oh," he says, "I must have dropped that when I brought the cash drawers back here. Thanks. I really appreciate you, being honest and bringing that to me." I was like, "Yeah, no problem. It's the right thing to do." Didn't think anything of it for, a handful of time, a year or two went by and I got a little older. As I was a teenager, I got a little older and I still worked there and I was manager of the restaurant. And the old man taught me the trick. He says, "So, hey, you take a $20 bill." And he says, "It's a cheap lesson, right?
Yes.
If the guy puts the 20 in his pocket, now there's at least a clue there, right?" And
yeah, I think I would argue that was the best $20 you ever spent.
Mm-hmm.
That's cheap money. Data mentioned earlier about the Midwest Preparedness Project. One of my, and I probably shouldn't say this because then it lets it all out of the bag, but one of my favorite things at that event is the Barter Town, because, I can sit there and if someone will allow themselves to totally take advantage of somebody else, to me, that's just an amazing clue. And I've put myself in that situation numerous times to say, let's see what happens right here. Let's see if they care that I got a good deal too. Now, there's nothing wrong with getting a good deal, but if you're going to take advantage of me to better yourself, then I probably don't want to be in a depression with you. Right? I want someone who's going to look out for me. And so I think there's a lot of those little things like that. As we mentioned about the golf club or about, some of those things that we were at a camp out in, oh goodness, it was a long ways away. It was, I don't know, 6 or 8 hours away from where I live. And we did a camp out and there was, I had a nice military backpack. And Dave, I think you were at that camp out. I don't even remember this or not. But anyway, there was a guy there who wanted the backpack really bad and he wanted to trade me some stuff. And what he was trying to trade me was probably worth a tenth of, what this backpack was. And it was cool, man. I learned right there, okay, next, I'm not going to invest any more of my energy capital into fostering this relationship or investing into this person, because when it all comes down to it, he's just going to look out for himself. You guys have any other examples of where that's true? Other things that have gone on inside the, the group dynamic?
Sure. I think, there's be cautious about these tests, don't set people up for complete failure too.
Oh, of course.
Some of this is literal and some of it's not. Another thing that I think is good is offering charity. You offer charity to somebody else, how they receive it. Again, this is not necessarily a conclusion. This is just a good way to find clues, like, maybe to determine what their means are, what their abilities are. And when you offer charity to somebody, I have all these old guys that have taught me things my whole life, right? And I guess I'm getting to be an old guy by the gray of my beard. But one guy told me something. He said, when you dump water on the ground, it's not yours anymore. And whatever happens to that water, wherever it goes, it's not yours anymore. Let it go, you know? And I've thought a lot about what he said there. And I think in some ways, you know, like offering charity in our prepper groups, you know, is a similar thing. If you give somebody something and they do something with it, don't be mad that they didn't use it in exactly the purpose you wanted, right?
Right.
Don't take that as a conclusion of like, well, he's not going to do what I want. Well, he may have had a different need for it than what you realized, or she. And then likewise, we all come with different set of means, you know, as far as means, meaning like, you know, capital and the ability to spend money. And, you know, you never know what charity you offer somebody right now might really, really mean something to them. And there's something that may not be a big deal for them to give to you. Maybe they don't have the cash or the capital, but they can come help you frame up a window to put in your house and, you know, not charge you for it or something. So just always have your mind open to these things, you know, don't draw strict, complete conclusions about this. Just, I guess this is more testing, but it's like a girlfriend, you know, you're going to get married to her, you know, you got to see how she reacts to different things. Or, you know, a boyfriend, does he open the door for you? Okay. Does he not open the door anymore a year later? Well, you know.
Yeah. You know, I love how you say it's a clue, not a conclusion. And that's just a great saying, you know, to follow. And you're right, but everybody does have, you know, lots of different resources, but I think there's some universal truths. And, you know, part of the reason why I like the campouts, for example, you know, we did a camp out in another state, you know, ways away, and went down there, and dude, it rained. I'm telling you, from the time we got there to the time we left, it was a sopping muddy mess. And the way people behaved when their chair was wet, right? The way they behaved when that pressure and that stress was on, you know, I want to be around the person who, no matter what's going on, can poke fun at me and call me old man or whatever, you know, whatever it is. I want to be around those kind of people. And so I think that, right. I think in those high stress situations, you know, yeah, thank you very much. And you're not very far behind. So just for the record, I think those high stress situations, you know, really help you, you know, kind of identify some of those virtues. And, you know, when we talk about virtues, Bobby, you talked a little bit earlier about, you know, your wife, your wallet, and your life. And I think there's some universal, you know, virtues out there that I'm going to look for. You know, it used to be years ago, you know, 15 years ago, I thought that it was all about, you know, character over skill over supply. And I really kind of believed all of that. And then after going through a whole bunch of time and effort, I come to realize that attitude and commitment are probably worth more. You know, and you talked about truth. So do you guys have virtues that you guys look at that you would put, you know, high on the list? Data, let's start with you. What virtues do you like?
Oh gosh, you know, we've had several mentions of them throughout this, you know, discussion. You know, character and commitment are very high on the list. So is that, you know, I guess trust and that honesty that Bobby spoke or touched on. Excuse me, Spags touched on earlier. Yeah, I'd say that those virtues are going to vary from person to person. Mine are pretty much in the core, you know, kind of like what Spags had touched on earlier. If I can trust you with my life, my wife, or my, you know, my wallet, I trust you pretty well. That means that we've broke bread together. We have dug ditches together. There's a Bulgarian gentleman that we knew. You know, we all know, and he speaks of, he uses a term, you know, if we've eaten a bag of salt together. I look for those types of things, you know, people that have been through those hard or harsh scenarios. And we've been through some of them. We've been through a lot of them. And yeah.
Yeah. Hitch, what about you?
As far as virtues?
Yeah, as far as like, if you're looking at somebody, you know, what are you looking for?
Well, yeah, I mean, the honesty is really important. You know, and that also includes being honest with themselves. You know, if they're not honest with themselves, how could they be honest with anybody else?
Yeah.
I guess I'm thinking about, there's some things that I would look for to avoid, you know.
Oh, that's a good topic.
People who have addiction issues that are unaddressed, you know, like some of the addiction issue that's addressed and they've got it under control, is one thing. But, you know, if you pick up any clues that a person has an addiction issue, that could really be bad for your group. This people with other unaddressed personal issues, whether it be, I'm jumping around the topic here, but, if people should have mental illness or other, unchecked emotional disorders. And, I've been around people that have bipolar disorder, and that is, if it's not treated, that's rough, really, really rough. And, you don't know what you're going to get sometimes. But, going back to virtues, the honesty, the integrity, the golden rule, they do unto others, they have do unto them. I mean, those things are pretty important.
Yeah. Bobby, you got virtues beyond honesty. That's the one that you mentioned right off the top. You have anything else you want to add? And then let's talk about what to avoid as Hitch brought up.
Avoid talkers, encourage doers. And that can apply in multiple ways. If you meet somebody and they're the guy who has a basement loaded with brand new shit sitting on the shelves and they've never touched it, but they want to extol their virtue as a seasoned prepper, homesteader, whatever, you should probably avoid them. The person who buys something, goes out, tests it, breaks the hell out of it, and then will tell you, yeah, don't waste your money like I do. I'd rather talk to him. I'd rather talk to the guy who has learned through a million failures than the guy who tried to buy himself to heaven.
Yeah. So a community of doers. I think that's a really good, kind of bullet point you could put the top of this, this whole process. I really like that. The community of doers. Data, what about you? Anything you particularly look for to avoid?
I've swung very far on the scale as far as that. Things to avoid pendulum is concerned, because like was mentioned earlier, I was at that camp out where it rained cats and dogs for days on end, and it was very fascinating to me to see the guy that was the stalwart, strong. I'm a Boy Scout type guy, just melt into a pile of emotional rage and frustration when his chair got wet. But then the guy that was typically not as useful around camp or not as helpful, or just kind of we would call him a Cletus, down in the South, just kind of a Cletus around camp. He was the most helpful dude the entire week, digging trenches for people's drainage and helping move people's, water soaked belongings and hanging them up and wringing out towels. And that dude worked himself into damn near a heart attack trying to take care of people. And it was just interesting for me to see those types of swings. So I've grown cautious over the years of kind of the things to avoid. But there's a staple, you speak about a particular toxic type person. I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, but there are personalities that just, you're just not going to click with, because they either have some type of addiction problem or some type of mental or physical ailment that kind of handicaps their growth or their comfort zone per se. And I've just found that it's best to try to avoid those toxic types, like Spags had mentioned, that will either one up you or like Brother Hitch had mentioned, they have some deep psychological or physical addictions that they just makes it impossible to be around them.
Yeah, one of the things that I try to avoid is I always try to look for people who have empathy. If you can't put yourself in somebody else's shoes, right? And even all the way down to the, we were talking about the camp out, and having a meltdown. And I totally forgot about that guy who was totally helping everybody out, who was not traditional. That wouldn't be in that traditional role. But anyway, just as far as empathy goes, being able to, to put yourself in those shoes and not be judgmental and, just, try to understand. So I try to avoid the judgmental people, I guess is the way I would say that. People who are quick to point out, those kind of things. Well, as I mentioned before, we're going to do 4 of these videos. The next one we're going to do is on, the first circle and the bigger circle, the one that's on the outside, because everything grows in from that. And so the last topic I'd like to talk about today is how a spouse plays a role in all of this. I cannot tell you the number of comments I get that are about things like, man, I really wish, I had a spouse like, like your wife, or a woman saying, I wish my husband was more on board, or or whatever it is. So when you're out there, and I hate to use the word recruiting, but when you're out there vetting all of this, I'd like to hear everybody talk a little bit about how much weight do you put in the spouse and the spouse's involvement into the whole thing. We'll start with you, Data.
Oh goodness. The term happy house, happy spouse is applicable there, because I know you guys know the same guy, but we have a mutual friend, that's in one of these mags, in one of these potential circles, that he is. I think he's center of the road. He's kind of probably right, leaning at the very lightest sense of the word, but his spouse, however, is a left-leaning, what he calls his own wife a loony leftist, which is just mind-boggling to me. And so I think having that type of duality in a family where the guy is on board and the wife is completely, she's like, you're bat poop crazy, but whatever floats your boat, honey. There's a lot of that goes on in these circles.
Yeah. So would that deter you from, pursuing that person? Would you care? Does it matter?
In regards to the spouse playing a role, I mean, it severely handicaps his ability to do things or to attend functions, or the way that people's groups are structured. For the most part, the majority of them that I've either talked to or participated in, they typically require, if there is a couple with children, that the couple and the children all participate, either in slaughtering animals, or doing a community garden, or some type of community project, whether it's putting up lumber or firewood or whatever. And if the spouse is not going to participate, if she's just going to be a nut on a log, or stay in the house, or just be unhelpful in general, man, it makes it very hard to court those people, no matter how much you like the other person.
Yeah. Hitch, what do you think about this?
I have 2 failed marriages, so there's a lot I could say about this, but
Yeah.
Dave Ramsey talked about one time about the 4 most common issues that in a failed marriage, and it was money, kids, religion, and parents. Money being how you're going to earn it, how you're going to spend it, how you're going to save it. Kids being, are you going to have some, how you're going to raise them. Religion, can your religion mesh together, you and her. And then of course that goes back to kids and how you're going to raise your kids with that religion. Parents, kind of goes back to the gospel in Genesis 2:20, where you cleave from your parents to your spouse. And are you going to do that completely? Are you going to stand up for your spouse ahead of your mother or your father, or in some cases your kids, what they might say, because essentially you're marrying that spouse for the rest of your life. And so in this case, I'd add number 5. If you're a person who's single and watching this video, then you need to see what their mindset is on prepping, and, for lack of a better word, conspiracy theories, because as has been coined lately, the difference between a conspiracy theory and reality is 6 months. And I'll hat tip to Mark Moss for that, because I saw him the other day talking about that. But yeah, well, hang on, I have this handy just in case. But anyway, just for you, Spags, I had that just for
Working
you.
on his tan. That's all he's doing. He's working on his tan.
But if your spouse is not going to be on board with your geopolitical views of the world and what's going on, and your mentality of homesteading or prepping or whatever, but you're going to have a tough road to hoe. I mean, that's going to be tough. So if you're already married to somebody and you've decided to head down this path, I don't have any good answers for you how to get your spouse on board. I'm honest with you. If you didn't cover those first 4 things in the beginning, this one's going to be hard. And I don't, maybe one of you guys has something to say about that. But before I yield, I'd say from personal experience, you know, having a spouse that maybe is a little sour to the situation can really, really be hard on a group.
Bobby?
Every decision in life is an economic decision. And I mean that. Every decision you make is an economic decision. And people will disagree with that, but those are people who equate money and economics. Economics is the ebb and flow and exchange of services and goods. And when you choose people based on the exchange of goods and services, whether you admit it or not. The same happens with your spouse, especially when you're talking about prepping. I will agree that 99% of the time, if your spouse is not lockstep in some manner with the mentality, it will cause a huge problem. I have met one couple in the 20 some years I've been doing this that was the exception. And I'll pose it like this. If you can find a couple who have opposing viewpoints, who have been successfully married for 15 years or more with kids and both still prep, you may have just found the golden nugget to everything we've talked about, because they are going to know how to have the empathy. They are going to know how to have the compassion. They're going to know how to have the understanding and the compromise and all these other big multi-syllable words that basically boil down to being able to coexist in the same small, tight place under really austere measures. So I guess what I'm saying is always be aware of the fact that there is a exception to every rule. Mm-hmm. And that exception is still based on essentially economics.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna run by everybody and give everybody a final word as we leave here. But I think to one of Hitch's points earlier, you know, it's a clue, not a conclusion. I mean, I know, you know, several couples who, not that the spouse was opposed, but just wasn't quite 100% on board, and through time and pressure and experiences and you know, whatever the event was that caused them, you know, to kind of go, wait a second, maybe, you know, that those things do happen. And so, you know, have hope, you know, in that, but having a spouse that's on board is certainly helpful. So I need to get out of here. I got stuff to do, but real quick, final words. Let's start with you, Hitch. You got any final words to that, to, you know, that couple, that community out there that's trying to figure out how to build a community? You got anything you'd like to say before we leave?
Go be involved. You know, go be involved in your local community, your regional community. You know, just get out there and meet people and open your mouth and, you know, be involved.
Yeah. Data?
No, you know, go out and find your tribe. You know, go to the campouts, go to the group meetings that are being held in your community. Like was mentioned, strike up that conversation with the dude next time you're admiring the sawmill or the wood chipper. Mm-hmm. Go be involved.
Yeah. Bobby?
The only home run you miss is the one you fail to swing at.
Oh, love it. Yeah.
And the real question at the base of that is what equals a home run?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think, you know, my parting advice, you know, in all of this comes back to something that, you know, both, you know, a lot of these guys have talked about today is manipulation with good intent is okay. You know, and, you know, just go out there and try to make a difference and try to be the difference and, you know, try to lead in that example. And I think you become magnetic. And I think at that point, people will follow. But again, we're going to do 4 of these videos. The next one, we're going to come out, we're going to talk about that first ring, about its uses, you know, how to put it together and those kind of things and how you know, kind of progress through there. So I guess until then, guys, we'll see you all later. And, you know, like I always say, hold the line, don't give an inch. See ya.